we have got to talk about the news and the news that broke this morning, which is the end of the Deshaun Watson suspension ordeal, that the NFL will drop its appeal of the Deshaun Watson suspension with a settlement that calls for Watson to be suspended for 11 games and pay a $5 million fine. Then Watson proceeded to go out and do a press availability at the Cleveland Browns practice facility where he showed no remorse whatsoever and said that he basically wanted to apologize to anybody who got triggered by the whole affair. How I felt about this when the announcement first came down and there was an official announcement from Watson of apologizing, and then how I feel about it now after he's done his little press availability are actually a little bit different. Let's find out how Mike and Bryan feel first.
I believe in second chances. I do believe in the ability to learn from one's mistakes and to grow and develop as a person. But step one of that process, step zero of that process is admitting fault. It's understanding that what you did was wrong, because you can't improve about it until you acknowledge it and understand that. And the fact that Watson is coming out and saying that he's always been saying on his innocence, that he's never disrespected anyone, even if you don't believe a single thing that any of the women have said, even if you only believe what Watson himself has claimed, he absolutely 100% has disrespected these people. If you can't even acknowledge that on the day when you have finally come to a legal resolution about your problems, if you can't even admit the slightest bit of guilt or culpability, what are you doing here? What you can't improve. You can't get past that point until you admit fault. And that's ultimately my problem with this not being an indefinite suspension, because he hasn't learned anything. We're exactly where we were a year and a half ago.
Yeah, there's a concept called restorative justice that's pretty well documented, and it has success. It's used in classrooms. It's been used by governments in the past to try to repatriate people in different situations. And it always starts with what you said, Bryan, like the admission, the recognition of the guilt of the action and the consequences that should match that, and then a journey back. And then it's absolutely about bringing people back into the fold with a consequence that makes sense, with punishments that fit the crime.
I understand why the NFL wanted a settlement. They didn't want to go to the appeals process, because then there was a possibility that the NFLPA could then appeal things to a federal court and find problem with the way that the CBA is written. And at a certain point, we had to stop doing this. We had to come to some sort of resolution about this. So I understand why the league was like, we got a longer suspension, we got a fine, let's move on. But the way that Watson then went out and didn't show any remorse, it's painful.
Nauseating. It's nauseating. Like I went from, I understand this. Let's start to move on to, I'm sick to my stomach. And, while you were doing the intro, the Haslams were up there. Jimmy Haslam was up there, completely tripling down on all of this. And, doing this as a second chance and making him out like he's doing something benevolent in this case. I feel compromised having to do this right now.
I feel like there's no way around that. I mean, even
I know. I'm not saying
out with the settlement, I was like, no matter what they announced, we were all going to feel a little dirty about it, unless they announced that Watson could never play again. And even then, I'd feel a little dirty, because then I'd feel like, well, the guy deserves some kind of second chance if he shows remorse, right? Like that would have been too much. Like the fact is, he did a bad thing that makes us all uncomfortable to talk about. There's no way to talk about it without getting uncomfortable.
Right.
But it just, you wanted to see some remorse. You wanted to see some remorse, and there's just none.
You get the opposite of remorse. That's what we really got here. The opposite of the remorse. It's like, I got away with it, you bastards. I'll be back in December. That's pretty much what you're getting today.
And it must be uncomfortable to be a Cleveland Browns fan. This whole process has been uncomfortable because of the fact that the Cleveland front office has been associated with analytics. I have friends who work in the Cleveland front office. For people who are diehard fans of this team and have been for years and years, it's just uncomfortable. You don't decide as a fan of the team who wears the uniform that you root for. And it just feels like the Browns are so desperate for the winning. I mean, some team was going to be so desperate for the winning that they were going to never make Watson face like serious circumstances.
Right.
And that it just happens to be the Browns were the team, but it just feels so uncomfortable. People have pointed out the 11-game length of the suspension likely has to do with the way contracts are told in the NFL. That you have to play 6 games in order to toll your contract to the next year. And that matters for how many years of his contract to toll and when he becomes a free agent again and whatever. And so that's the reason. But the fact that it ends up with Cleveland at Houston as the first game, like the league has a responsibility to hide that game. They honestly have a responsibility to have that game shown in Cleveland and Houston and maybe Austin and San Antonio, and that is it.
It's a 1 o'clock game. It should be this regional nonsense. You're exactly right. If I start saying it flexed out or something like that, I'm going to puke.
I think that the league understands that not all publicity is good publicity.
Right.
And that if it looks like they specifically made this suspension so that they could flex that game to prime time and make a big deal of it, they are going to get smacked in the press. And I would hope the league wants to stay away from that.